I guess if you're going to give a weather presentation, doing it when it's like +6 out in the middle of December in southern Alberta is not a bad start. So anyway, that's what I'm going to do in this presentation, talk a little bit about the main weather factors I see coming up here. We'll start off sort of go around the globe, because there are some things going on right now that I think you should be aware of, especially as you're starting into that cropping, planting decision mode here, because I think there's a number of things coming up from the atmospheric conditions that we can sort of count on. And then what we'll do is we'll bring it back to Western Canada and try to talk a little bit about what the weather's going to be like. I think we have a pretty good idea of the winter, but and then stretching into the spring a little bit where things are a little fuzzier, let's say. So first of all, we're going to start off with El Nino. Actually, I'm not going to cover it absolutely first, but we're going to look at the impact of El Nino this year. We've got India and Australia, I think, something that we have to concentrate on there. Again, Australia helping out our wheat market and pulse market, and oilseeds to some extent, and certainly India critical for the pulse market. So something to take a look at there. Future El Nino impact, the winter weather in North America here, impact on the Indian monsoon, and then South American corn, especially Brazilian corn, something to take a look at, again, impacting our feed grain markets. We also have to take a look a little bit at the North Atlantic Oscillation Index. It's also a factor this year, and particularly for Durum and other European crops. So something to just mull here. I know southern Alberta here, big Durum country, something that you have to take a look at. So an unknown factor in this whole thing is that I did study soil science when I was going to university. And so I always start off with a soil moisture map. And this is the current November calculated soil moisture anomaly globally. Okay, this is a very simple model, far simpler than all the science that you guys have probably seen over the past couple of days here. But it's still rather effective. You can see there's a big red blob I've circled over Western Canada here. No surprise to you guys, we are on the dry side. It's not totally accurate. Again, I think some of the northern growing areas are a little bit better off than this would portray. Northern Europe, stretching all the way into Ukraine and southern Russia, that area is dry. Still haven't recovered from that southern summer drought. So something just to keep a close eye on. And then the rest of the activity is all in the southern hemisphere here, I think. Australia's in a drought, India's on the dry side, South Africa is in a drought situation, and we're seeing some dryness start to crop up in northern Brazil. So we'll go through the impacts there, and how those things translate out, and how these weather factors impact those regions in the coming months. So let's take a look at the North Atlantic. I want to say the North American oscillation, because I'm used to the NAFTA agreement and stuff. But anyway, the North Atlantic Oscillation in the positive phase. This is the best graphic, I think, that portrays what's going on here. But we are in a positive phase right now. And what theoretically should happen is the North African Mediterranean basin should remain fairly dry. The only concern that I have from this is that we're starting to see that dip. If you take a look here, and this goes back to 1951, this parameter itself has been monitored only since the 50s that we've had the data for it. But you can see basically the oscillation goes from negative, which is below the line there, and it spent most of the time between 1951 and the late 70s in the negative phase, and then it boosted up in the 90s, came back down in the early 2000s, a little bit more mixed, and then for the last few years we've been in the positive phase. It's a very good indicator of how much moisture they're going to get in the winter season in the Mediterranean, and generally speaking they have been a bit on the drier side, It hasn't impacted crops as much as you would think, just given some of the other factors that have happened there. But certainly, it's something to take a look at here. But if you take a look at those ups and down arrows, or the blue lines, you can see they're starting to degrade here. And it appears as if we're probably going to be into a negative phase again, probably by the end of this winter. So in terms of help on the Durum front, and Durum is a tire fire right now, in terms of the markets themselves, I think we're going to have a waning influence of this on production in the key importing region there. If you take a look at the percent of normal precipitation for the month of November, again, this is under the still positive NAO. You can see that Europe has remained dry, and no surprise that dry subsoil moisture up in the northern areas, Germany, Poland. Under this model, you would say that those areas are probably going to improve as we go along. We have seen some impact on the plantings, though, in Europe already from this dryness. Quite a considerably smaller winter rapeseed crop being planted this year. And as well, we've even planted less durum in parts of the south, mostly because the prices are lower, but also because the planting conditions haven't been ideal. If you take a look at those impacts of that weather conditions, basically with this lower rapeseed area, lower durum area, you have to plant something, and that's actually going to come back in terms of winter wheat. So again, the winter wheat area is going to rise. That again is going to impact prices on the wheat side here as we go forward. If we take a look specifically at North Africa and how much rainfall they got in November. So that last map was the percent of normal. This is a map of actual amounts, because farmers in North Africa plant during the month of November. Actually, they wait until it rains and then they plant. And you can see here from Morocco all the way to Tunisia, they've had some reasonable starting moisture here. Again, they're farmers like us in a way, in that they need at least an inch of rain to get going, or thereabouts in terms of the dry soils there. And so they've got that. Essentially, some of the areas in eastern Algeria are still a little bit dry, but they've been managing to plant into moisture. Now the critical part, and this is where that NAO comes in, is over the next 3 months. Because during the month of December, January, February is when they get the bulk of their precipitation for their crop. And this is the difference between higher or low yields. So as long as the NAO remains positive, we see lower amounts of precipitation in this region, chances are then the yields will be lower. And that's something the durum market desperately needs right now, because we need to see some additional demand coming from this part of the world. If you hop across the Mediterranean to Europe, southern Europe, you can see Italy, Spain, and France. Again, not a bad start in terms of starting soil moisture here, but Italy and Spain and France are much the same. Southern France are much the same in terms of North Africa. Mediterranean climate, they need the rainfall over the next 3 months. And climate indicators are showing that we're not going to see it. The good part about this is that we'll actually be able to see the data before you guys plant your durum crop in the upcoming year. So just monitor this very, very closely. How much rain is this region receiving? The current indicators are that they're probably going to be a bit drier than normal, and that's something we need. Just wanted to remind you a little bit. Here's the southwestern cash durum prices, and then the spread to CWRS. Durum prices are really in the doldrum here, and we're going to need this to see a shock in terms of weather in order to push this out of it. So let's turn to El Nino, because that's the primary weather driver that everybody talks about. It's probably the most sexy of all of these teleconnections. And there's probably, I would say, about 8 teleconnections globally that have been identified that actually have some capability of predicting what the weather is. But El Nino is probably the most well-known. If you see here, this is the average sea surface temperature anomaly across the equator. We're at that 1 degree to 2 degree deviation from normal. The Australian Weather Bureau and NOAA in the US have not declared it an El Nino yet, but when I see this kind of a chart, we're definitely in an El Nino. And there's really footprints all over the place that we are seeing this El Nino this year. Now, just to remind you what happens during the December-February period in an El Nino, and that's basically what's happening here. Warm temperatures here in Western Canada, especially in the western side of the prairies, check. Warm in Australia, check. Also a drought in Australia that's not on there as well. Dry and warm in South Africa, you saw from the map, certainly developing some soil moisture deficits there. And some warmth there in the Southeast Asian basin, especially in the palm oil growing areas, but also up into India. And I think that's something to watch very, very closely. If you swing over to South America, there's dryness in northern Brazil. And we'll talk a little bit about how that dryness in northern Brazil really has an impact, well, could it potentially impact the markets here as we go into the, let's say, about the April through June period here on the feed grain side. So let's quickly turn to Australia. It's been a dry growing season there. There's been a difference, though, between the eastern and western areas. This is just a percent of normal precipitation. I've circled sort of the main growing areas. And these are numbers from the 1st of September to 30th November, the bulk of their growing season. Some of the northern growing areas are already harvesting by late October, so it's not perfect, but it's hard to pick a time period there. You can see in the western areas, it's a mixed situation, but mostly good. They're mostly above normal precipitation across the western grain belt. So they have good amount of wheat and barley from those areas. On the eastern side, though, it's been a real drought. And that's impacted the pulses, it's impacted the canola, because South Australia, which is the area to the southern part of that circle on the eastern side of Australia, is the main producer. And as well, it's also impacted wheat. So this is something that I think, as we move through this marketing year over the next 2 or 3 months, is going to become critical here, because in eastern Australia, that's where some of their higher quality wheat is grown, higher protein. It competes directly with the Canadian and the US spring wheat crops. So I'm somewhat positive in terms of the wheat fundamentals going forward here. This is one of the reasons why, because Australian crop is smaller. If you take a look at their production over the last 10 years, USDA just cut their number to 17 million tons. So you can see that's the lowest production that they've had over the past 10 years in Australia. It's also impacted, as I say, the canola and pulse crops there as well. Those are down very significantly from last year and from their 5-year average. So certainly El Nino's had its impact already globally. Another area that we've seen an impact is in India. Now, when I talk about Indian pulse crops, the situation with India is mostly a political one. It's got really nothing to do with other things, other than the fact that they have a lot of internal pulses, and they wanted to keep prices higher because farmers who vote in large numbers for the current government would like to see higher prices, so that's what the government has done. But you can see over this past year, we had a monsoon that was close to normal, a little bit below normal, but now we're into the off-season growing period. And you can see the bulk of the country is below normal. The yellow indicates below normal. In terms of total amounts of precipitation, it doesn't look like much. It's ranging between 1 inch and about 3 inches. But this is critical moisture that they need to get their pulse crops planted for the upcoming season. And it doesn't look like they're going to get it. And certainly, since we are in an El Nino, or going to be into a soon declared El Nino, chances are that we're not going to get a lot more moisture in this area. So it's something that's positive. Political considerations aside, I think this year's pulse production in India is going to drop here because we're going to see lower area plus some concerns here about the growing season itself for the winter crop. The other thing about it is that the El Nino does impact next year's monsoon, usually negatively. So we could probably be winding up for about 2 years in a row of substandard monsoon rains. That's positive. Certainly would put India back into an import situation, not only for the pulse crops, but for some oilseeds as well as for wheat in the upcoming years. So something to just keep an eye on. India produces a lot of grain, but they do rely on this monsoonal moisture, and El Nino puts that at risk. So here's the percent of normal precipitation in Brazil and Argentina. I just wanted or in Brazil specifically here, I just wanted to point out, although some of those areas in the northern parts of Brazil were drying out a bit, the circled areas, and those are essentially, the northern one is the new croplands that are growing there, and the southern one is the old traditional croplands that are growing there, both of those areas produce soybeans. The bulk of the soybeans is now in the northern part, or in that new cropland bubble. Those crops were planted early. They had good moisture, and November and December are pretty critical months in terms of getting the moisture. You can see production in that northern bubble is going to be pretty good, so far at least anyway, because they've had quite a bit above normal moisture. There are some problems in the south a bit, but really moisture levels still are adequate in all areas except for parts of the coastal areas of Paraná. So really off to a good start on the soybean side in Brazil. That crop, because it was planted early, will be harvesting, well, starting at the end of this month and certainly into July, or into January. If you take a look at Argentina, they're even better off. In fact, they probably are a little bit too wet. I've circled the area there for their wheat crop. Their wheat's being harvested right now. We're about 2/3, 3/4 done on the harvest there, and they've actually had too much rain in those areas. So that's causing some quality problems. So El Nino has good impacts and bad impacts. The good impact is they've got the moisture, and last year they had a huge drought, which caused problems for their soybean and corn crops, but it also El Nino also gives them above normal moisture, which you'd think would be good, and it's certainly good for planting corn and soybeans this year, but certainly not very good for the wheat crop quality. So expect some quality problems, I think, in Argentina. Is it critical right now? No, not particularly, but especially since most of their wheat crop does get exported to Brazil, I think that probably there's an opportunity for Brazil to import more wheat in the next little while. If you take a look at South American soybean production, if you have a good crop in Brazil, Argentinian planting starting off pretty good too, about half of the crop in, you're looking at production, USDA puts it at about 177 million tons. It's probably going to be above 180, you know, by the time things are all said and done here. So El Nino is basically positive for soybeans, both in South America, both in Argentina and Brazil, and it's going to result in record production here. So just something to keep in mind. You have this big fight in the soybean world between China and the US. That's going to play out as it is, but quietly underneath the radar, or on top of the radar, or whatever you want to look at, South America is making a new production record. So I expect that to be very significant in oilseed markets here in the upcoming year. If you take a look at the impact, again, December and February, that dryness in northern Brazil, the crop it impacts is actually the corn crop. If you've seen presentations I've given before, I've used this picture in virtually everyone because it is so neat. In this picture, I was actually hanging out of a car window. We were on BR 163, this is about 4 years ago, which is the big soybean road that goes up north. We were traveling actually south on it. But basically you can see a combine pulling out of the soybean field. Now this is taken in the 3rd week in January, okay? And it was in central Mato Grosso. So just again, back to the thing, they planted the crop 2 weeks early. Fields in this region, if it's 2 weeks earlier than this, it'd probably be around the 1st week in January when they're harvesting. So this crop's imminently coming off very soon. The thing I want to note, and you see the arrow and the pointer, the arrow and the label there, you can see a little dot on the horizon there. That's the next soybean field down the line. And they're actually planting the corn crop. So what happens in this crop rotation? Brazilian government in this region makes you have a cover crop. Usually the cover crop in the past has been things like sugarcane or cotton. But in the last 5 to 7 years, we've really seen a jump up in the corn production. And Brazilian farmers are discovering that growing corn is probably the best thing to do with this land that they have to put a crop in anyway. So as you can see, they're planting almost immediately. Now the reason they plant right away is, first of all, because they have to put the cover crop in, but secondly, because they're still in the wet season in this region. In Mato Grosso and the areas up to the Amazon, the wet period essentially stretches from January through to about April. Then after April, it dries off considerably. Now, it's not Western Canada dry. It's sort of a tropical dry, but given the fact that the temperatures are typically 90, 95 Fahrenheit all the way through, even into their winter period there, certainly they need to have regular moisture. So what they're trying to do by planting the corn early is to get the crop through the reproductive phase into maturity before the real drought hits in the area. So if you take a look at corn production for next year, you can see last year we had an impact, both in Brazil and Argentina, from some of the agronomic things going on. So crop production dropped significantly, dropped below 120 million tons. This year, right now, USDA is saying we're going to get up to, I think it's about 137 million tons. But here's where El Nino comes in. Even though we're planting that corn crop early, it's probably a good chance that we're going to get into that dry season in Brazil early as well. So I think basically in terms of feed grains, this is positive because really, although Brazilian or Argentinian corn supplies are going to be good, Brazilian supplies probably are going to drop a little bit from what the current expectations are. So let's go to El Nino in North America here. This is something that I'd like to basically show you because it's been the weather pattern for the last 2 weeks, essentially. So even though we're not in an El Nino, this is what a winter weather pattern looks like. Now that area, the polar jet area, moves around. So I live in Winnipeg, which sort of sucks during an El Nino because sometimes it's warm and then sometimes it's really cold. And it's because that jet stream moves around a bit. Now this is consistent, it's a consistent pattern, but it doesn't mean that we don't have cold temperatures. It just means the frequency of them go down. But the probabilities increase as you go further west. So you can see we have a very warm pattern going on. Where the wetness is during an El Nino is down south. And I don't know if you caught the pictures last week from Carolinas and Arkansas and Lubbock, Texas, where they got a foot of snow. That's the weather pattern that El Nino brings. So again, I'm pretty convinced we're in this weather pattern and it's probably going to persist through most of the winter here, which is good news in Lethbridge because days like today are probably going to be more common than days where its temperatures are down around minus 15 or so. But there's a problem with that, and the problem is our precipitation that we've received in Western Canada. Now this is the growing season percent of normal, okay? So you'll see basically southern Alberta southern Saskatchewan, especially southwestern areas on the dry side. That dryness sort of even stretches up into parts of northeastern Saskatchewan as well. The areas that are wetter than normal are across the north. So in that El Nino pattern that I just showed you, where is the moisture going to fall? It's mostly along that polar jet stream. It's not going to be a lot of moisture because the polar jets typically, like that system is just typically drier. But any places that you're going to get more moisture is probably across the northern grain belt. So if you're a farmer in the northern grain belt, after struggling with this year's harvest, you'll be welcome to know that you're not going to be droughted out in the spring here because you're still going to have some snowfall around. Where the areas in the south are, so it does mean so we're not going to pick up a lot of winter precipitation. So we're going to start off this season like we have the last couple, minimum subsoil levels and dry topsoils, and we're going to rely on the moisture this spring. If you take a look at what happened from November 1st into the, I think this is December 10th. You can see we're actually a little bit above normal right now in terms of the winter precipitation. That's from that one snowstorm, essentially one snowstorm that's moved through. And the rest of it really, and so that's how exceptional it was. By the time we get to the end of the winter time, this is going to look somewhat different because that wasn't enough to do us for the entire winter. The eastern areas, the Manitoba, parts of eastern Saskatchewan, those areas will probably get bluer as we go across in through January and February. Now I want to talk, okay, so I've talked about El Nino and its impact on the winter. I thought I'd talk a little bit about transportation and oil. This is sort of a divergent thing, but I think it's something, El Nino, dry winters, warm winters affect more than just our soil moisture situation. It also impacts our delivery systems. And I think there's something that we have to pay attention to here. Everyone remembers 1314. I think in all of the talks that I give across Western Canada, everybody brings that up. Oh, remember 2013-14. I think what we have to remember though, and because there is some hysteria in terms of this new oil movement by crude, etc. You've got to remember the corridor and capacity are the main things that impact this. Grain movement, especially from, let's say, Lethbridge, from Alberta, from most of Saskatchewan, is basically out to the coast. So that's the corridor that you're on with your grain. Oil movement is basically from northern Alberta, parts of Saskatchewan, down into the US Midwest and down south. So the corridors are different. So if I'm giving this talk in southeastern Saskatchewan or southwestern Manitoba, I would say yes, you definitely probably are going to be impacted by some of this capacity that's being used to move oil down to the US. It may influence your milling bids from US mills. But out here, no, virtually none of this oil is going to go out west, so it's not going to be competing. What are the commodities that compete oil with grain? Usually potash and coal. Those are the other ones. Coal really isn't ramping up here by the looks of it. Economic growth is so-so. Potash movement has been good, but it really, really those two commodities. And unless we get into a situation where they have to rob crews and trains, as in locomotives, from the east-west movement out to the coast, then grain movement's going to be fine. The reason I bring El Nino into this is that with good conditions in Western Canada here for movement, which is what an El Nino brings us, it doesn't bring us that cold, nasty winter where everybody's complaining about how cold it is and they have to shorten the length of trains, all that good stuff. This is not the kind of weather picture that we're going to have. The other thing I want to do is to just point out, and these are rather complicated graphs here, but I just want to go through the numbers with you. This is from the AAR for Canadian railroads. Now there's a bit of a gotcha in this data. Both of our railways do own U.S. facility or U.S. portions, and this would include some U.S. grain as well. But you can see the gray line is this year, the orange line is last year, and the blue line is 2 years ago. So you can see, basically we've been keeping up here this fall. There was a bit of a dip in October, but I think that was more related to some of the harvest issues we had. We did get out of synchronicity on the grain movement here with certain commodities because we thought they were going to be harvested, and we took about a 6-week break between, finishing the harvest, starting the harvest and finishing the harvest. If you take a look at petroleum carloads, this is before all of the news that hit. We have already been experiencing this since June, where the core loads of oil have gone and ramped up. So really, we're talking a little bit about additional capacity here, but some of this has already happened, and the system has been working quite well. Now, mind you, it isn't in the heart of the winter, and we'll have to, again, hope that this El Nino doesn't cause any problems on the transportation front, but I'm pretty certain that we're probably going to see a fairly seamless transition here, given the fact that it looks like the West Coast movement should keep good because of the weather conditions. Crude by rail exports is a slightly different data set. This goes to September, but you can see again, same picture. May, June is when we started to ramp this up. We didn't see a lot of transportation difficulties in the intervening period, so I would say we're probably maybe a little bit hysteric about this right now. Should we, over the long term, that's a rail issue capacity thing that's going to happen here. But my opinion is that they probably are going to handle it reasonably well because they have very good visibility on the resources that they need to put to this oil by rail. So something not to worry about. The last graphic is just showing you where this rail movement goes to. It goes by my house, by the way. This is why I'm so interested in it, because in order to get across to the store, I have to wait at railway crossings that have these oil trains just streaming on by. So there's always a vested interest in all of this. So let's move a little bit further on. This is for our winter, moving from the winter forecast, which is essentially warm and dry. What you see is what you get today, essentially, for most of the rest of the winter. There'll be a few storms, probably below normal precipitation, but basically what you see is what you get for the winter. So let's go take a look at the June to August impact of El Nino. The first thing I want you to notice is that there are no impacts on the northern side of the hemisphere. By the time that we get through into April and May, El Ninos tend not to influence our weather. Second thing is, in an El Nino, they typically start to go down, move towards neutral by that period in time anyway. Now the concern is if we went dramatically or quickly into a La Nina, and none of the models say that that's going to happen, but you'll hear about it very quickly if they start to. That is a prescription for us to be drier than normal. Otherwise, if it's a typical progression out of El Nino into a neutral phase for most of June, July, August, and that's the most probable thing to happen right now, we will receive normal precipitation. So that's the forecast for this summer. Normal precipitation, unless we hit that really quick drop off of El Nino into a La Nina. And really the models aren't showing that right now. So I think that's an important thing to remind yourselves. There is a problem with having these low soil moisture levels for 2 years in a row. Basically, if we don't get, we rely on local moisture for a significant part of our precipitation in the summertime. In other words, rain gets rain, no rain gets no rain. So that is a concern right now, I would say, especially in the dry areas of the southern prairies. But again, that only accounts for approximately about 1/3 of the moisture that we get. The other 2/3 is from very large systems and where the jet streams set up. And the data right now says where the jet streams step up, we should have pretty reasonable precipitation, spring and winter. Just a quick look at the Environment Canada viewpoint on this. And again, this is for the winter period here. They have, in terms of the precipitation outlook, and this is December, January, Feb, basically they have above normal precipitation and normal temperatures. If there's a forecast that they put out that I totally disagree with, it's this one. I think we're going to be warmer than normal and below normal in terms of temperatures. Not to trash on Environment Canada. That's just my opinion here. For their summertime, they do have above normal temperatures out in the west coast and for parts of Alberta. And in terms of precipitation, close to normal. So I'd agree with the precipitation, the precipitation model here. I think we're probably going to be in for normal. Above normal temperatures, I think probably more west coast issues than here in Alberta. But anyway, that's just my opinion right now. So here's the takeout window for us today, and I'll get you on the way. I know a lot of you are probably antsy to get on the road and back to your homes. El Nino is here. It's already having an impact. It's impacting production in Australia. It's impacting production in South Africa. It's going to impact production in India probably here. Look out for the dryness in northern Brazil. And again, as I said, that crop gets planted up in northern Brazil. That corn crop gets planted here in January, February, even into a little bit of March. But look for dryness in those areas and how quickly it arrives. Because if it does arrive early, then that means a corn crop is going to go down. Their production isn't going to be, recovery isn't going to be as fast as what the market's been expecting. And it's probably positive for feed grain values both here and in the US. NAO is still positive for the winter, and as I said, it's probably going to be dry in the Mediterranean, which is good news. We do need to see a problem develop in some of the Durum importing regions right now because prices certainly are not very good at this moment. So with that, I'm willing to take some questions, and thanks for hanging out to the end of the conference here. So are there any questions? Is there going to be a white Christmas? Well, there's a little snow here in Lethbridge. That's the white that you're going to get. Let's just put it that way. The weather models this morning, very, very consistent into Christmas. Up in the northern grain belt in Alberta and Saskatchewan, there's slight chances of precipitation, but it looks fairly dry here for the next 2 weeks. So good news if you have to travel, drive, fly, whatever for Christmas. Bad news if you want a white Christmas, let's say. Now, you can solve that by going to Winnipeg, because we always have a white Christmas. We got snow all over the place.
Good question. Go ahead, you've got a question there?
Yeah, just one question regarding our reservoirs. They're quite low with the dry winter. Will they fill up, you think?
Probably not. Chances are, again, through this winter season, we'll see below normal precipitation in the mountains. So that should impact, again, the reservoir filling capacity. Now, we've had a couple of systems move in here in the last week that have dumped a fair amount into BC. But again, I don't think that's going to be a feature of the winter precipitation. We're probably going to see most of that precipitation swoop to the north and not be in the mountains for the reservoirs.
Anything interesting happening in the jet streams that you've been watching, Bruce?
Well, the jet streams were what we saw on that map. It's almost absolutely perfect. There's a southern jet that's going from California. And so we've gone from a situation where California's had wildfires to now mudslides. And that jet is pushing moisture across the southern U.S. They've also seen some below normal temperatures there, so they've received it in snow. And that's the persistent pattern that generally starts there. The polar jet, or the really cold temperatures, are further north. Like, so if you want to go up, you have to go to northern Alberta or Yukon to see where the polar stream is. And then it dips and it angles across the prairies, not across the prairies, mostly hugging along the northern prairies there. But right now that jet stream is even further north than that. It would be sort of dipping down between Churchill and Thompson in Manitoba right now. So it's a lot further north. And again, that's the pattern that usually sets up during an El Nino.
You know, and the other question that, being in the broadcast world, people always ask, and you know, we've been talking about new technology and all the new tools that are out there. Are there any new tools that are developing in terms of weather forecasting, or you know, are you seeing any new technologies that can help with the accuracy, or is weather still one of those things that it's inherently hard to accurately forecast, even on a long-term basis?
First of all, just my opinion on long-term forecasts, and if you see me speak before, you've probably heard this line before. The forecast accuracy has improved. It has improved out 5 days, especially for precipitation. Out 7 days for temperature, 7 to 10 day temperature is a pretty good indicator now. But in terms of long-term forecasts, really, if you want a reliable signal other than some things that you can garner from El Nino, and that moves the needle just a bit, you might as well make your own forecast, you know, figure out what you want to have. So if you want to have above normal precipitation this summer, that's a good forecast. Like, really, the long-term models, in some areas like Australia, those things work really well, but here in the middle of North America, not so much. So don't pay too much attention to them. That's always been my opinion. Has there been progress? Yes, there has, but it's very, very slow. People are throwing a ton of artificial intelligence at things, but again, you know, precipitation forecast for January 1st, 2019, it's a pick 'em, to be honest.
Yeah, forecasting's always been fairly creative art mixed in that science, hasn't it?
Yep.
All right, one last call. Any other questions for Bruce as you look at the impacts of weather on your crops for the year? All right, well, with that, thank you for giving us that very thorough and global perspective on weather, and we'll be watching for the El Nino declaration that we've heard about from you already. So thanks.